Thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for coming here. I'm going to start by talking about a somewhat different topic of what is history. It might seem obvious to you. History is a study of the past, but it's really the study of the human past, and actually more narrowly, it's the study of the relatively recent human past through documentary sources. For example, at Stanford University, if you study the ancient world, the Greeks and the Romans, you're going to be in the classics department, not the history department. This is changing, though, because there's a new movement in history to use other sources than written documents. For example, I have a colleague who's working on the Chinese railroad workers who built the Transcontinental Railroad, and there's almost no documentation. So he's turning to archaeology, to digs, to round this out. And we find there are other movements, deep history or big history. Deep history says that we should teach students history starting with the Big Bang. And Bill Gates is actually behind this and putting in a lot of money. Well, I'm not prepared to go that far back, but I am interested in very deep reaches of the human past that we can't find out simply by looking at records. We have to look at other sorts of topics. And this is sometimes called deep history. We shouldn't have that creature there because deep history is really the history of modern humans, the last 100,000 years or so. And to do this, we can look at things like archaeology and genetics and distribution of cultural features, but also language, because languages evolve from other languages and they get passed down over time. And we can trace back the histories of peoples often by looking at their languages and how they change and how they're distributed in various places. Can everybody hear me? Is the volume good? Okay, thank you. So that's what I want to do today, is talk about some of the promises, some of the benefits of using this linguistic approach, but also some of the problems that we can encounter, some of the pitfalls. And I'll do it by focusing on what is by far the largest language family. In other words, languages that originated from one common ancestral tongue spoken many thousands of years ago, and that's the Indo-European family. But before I get to that, I want to talk about some other families, and I also want to mention that I do this as a collaborative project because I'm a geographer. I teach in a history department. I'm not a linguist. And so I work with a linguist, Asa Perselweg, who's a lecturer in linguistics at Stanford. And so together we can use our expertise to take on some of these very large topics. So I'll start with a different language family, what's called Austronesian, and this is a great example because we can learn so much of the history of the peopling of the Pacific, all the way to Hawaii and New Zealand, and even to Madagascar. And we can trace those languages back to Taiwan. Most people in Taiwan speak Chinese, but there's a group called the Taiwanese Aborigines, and they speak languages in this family. And we know the family came from Taiwan because of the 11 subfamilies of Austronesian, 10 are in Taiwan. And one goes all the way from Hawaii to New Zealand to Madagascar. And so the fact that it has this deep diversity in Taiwan indicates that's where it originated. Madagascar is a fascinating example because it was one of the last big places reached by human beings, only about 1,500 years ago. Before that, no one. Even though it's very close to Africa, Africans had never got there. Through linguistics, we can trace out the settlement to one area on the island of Borneo in Indonesia, because their languages of Madagascar are most closely related to these East Barito languages. How did people some 1,500 years ago get from Indonesia to Madagascar? Well, we can use lots of sources of information to do this. We can find out from genetics, and that's really a new area of research that's enlightening us on the past. A recent study that suggests that only 30 women were responsible for the vast majority of the people, of these settlers who came to this unoccupied land. These geneticists thought, well, maybe it was an accidental crossing. But we can look at historical records and say, probably not, because at the time there was a powerful empire in what is now Indonesia, in Sumatra, a maritime empire deeply engaged in shipping called Sriwijaya. And they were sending out trade expeditions over a large area. They they were a literate civilization, but they mostly wrote about religion. They didn't write about their trading expeditions. So again, we go to other sources. Actually, we can go to Arabic sources who did write about this, and they wrote about a group of people called the Wak-Wak, who came in 1,000 ships. Well, probably not 1,000 ships, but they were trading all over East Africa. And one idea is maybe they sent people from Borneo to colonize Madagascar to supply them with rice and other foodstuffs as they were moving around trading in East Africa. And finally, we can look at even the distribution of cultural features. There's this oddity with xylophones. You find them in Indonesia and you find them in East Africa, and they're tuned the same way and they're used the same way. And so it's thought that this is something these Indonesians brought and spread them into East Africa. So again, multiple lines of evidence to give us sort of a richer sense of these deeper reaches of human history. There's a problem there, though, that we don't want to link in a linguistic group with a racial group or a group of people all descended from the same ancestors, because languages can spread outside of the group. And it looks like, again, from genetic research, that if you look at the people of Madagascar, about half of their genes come from Indonesia and about half come from Africa. So first people came from Indonesia, they settled it, and then they started probably bringing people in from Africa, maybe as slaves. Those people lost their own language. They picked up the language of these Indonesian colonists, but we know there was a lot of intermarriage, and eventually the populations pretty much melded together. Some groups in Madagascar look more African, some look more Indonesian, and a lot of them look sort of halfway in between. I mean, you look at these children, and he looks quite African, he doesn't look so African, and they could have easily be brother and sister, or brothers in that case. So, an interesting case, and this just shows some of the genetic components. This has long been a problem, though, this mixing of race and language. And what I put here is a page from my own childhood atlas, the World Book Atlas, 1964. My father sold World Book encyclopedias, and I spent a lot of time with this atlas. And even as a kid, it didn't make any sense. Because you see here, it says Caucasians and Mongolians, Mongolians meaning East Asians. And we see Finns, Hungarians, and Turks mapped as Mongolian, or at least partially Mongolian. What is there East Asian about people from Hungary? Nothing. Why did they have this idea? Here's another 62 atlas. Yellow skin color, Asiatic or Mongolian. They're not showing the Hungarians, but they're certainly showing the Finns and the Estonians as Asiatic or Mongolian. All you have to do is look at a Finn to know that there's not much Asiatic or Mongolian. The Finns are the lightest people in the world. They have the highest percentage of light eyes, and they have the highest percentage of light hair. So why would they be saying the Finns are Mongolian? Well, it's because they speak a language in what is known as the Uralic family. So do the Hungarians. Finnish and Hungarian, Estonian trace back to a common ancestor. And for a while it was thought that the Uralic languages were related to Mongolian languages. Linguists no longer think that's true at all. They share some features, but these were features that were probably borrowed. They weren't descended from a common ancestor. But for a long time, there was this so-called Ural-Altaic family. Linguists no longer buy it. Now, Turkic languages are used to be considered Ural-Altaic. Linguists definitely consider Turkic languages all to be related. They all stem from a common ancestor. And they're spoken in Turkey, through Central Asia, even a big part of China, all the way up into Siberia. But again, just because people speak languages that come from the same family doesn't mean that their genetic stock comes from the same group, because people can learn new languages. They can drop their language and pick up a new one. The Saka people who live way up in Siberia, they speak a Turkic language. They don't look like Turks. They look like Mongolians. In fact, the original Turks probably looked a lot like these people. It was relatively small groups, mostly of men, who moved into what is now Turkey, and they spread their language, but were genetically swamped out by others. So that's just a little bit of background about language and race and how they're intertwined, but sort of partially. So let's look at the Indo-European languages. It's like I say, by far the largest language family in the world. This shows its current distribution, or its distribution about 1950. Almost everywhere in Europe, not Finland, not Hungary, not the Basque area, but a vast zone. If we go back in time, 1500 AD or CE, if you will, Indo-European languages were spread throughout Europe, almost everywhere in Europe, all the way through Iran into North India. Some places they later disappeared, like Turkey or Anatolia. They were Indo-European speaking at this time. Later the Turks came in and spread their language. But that's as best we know how it used to look. So there's been a lot of theories about this because almost half of human beings on Earth today speak an Indo-European language. It's by far the largest. So how did it originate? How did, thousands of years ago there was one small group of people, probably a few thousand, speaking a language, and it separated and divided and gave birth to all these daughter languages that spread over half of the world. Why was it so successful? How did it spread so far? And where did it originate? So it was known that this was a language family ever since the late 1700s, when an English civil servant in Calcutta learned Sanskrit. And he knew Latin and he knew ancient Greek, and he said, oh my gosh, they look a lot the same. There must be some connection. So linguists started working on this, and the Germans really developed it in the 1800s. They figured out laws of sound change and regular developments, and they could trace it out. And so they were the ones who really developed. They preferred to call it Indo-Germanic rather than Indo-European. And the early theories from these Germans tended to think it was probably originated somewhere near Germany. Not all of them, but that was the most common view, and it spread outward. And at first this was just a linguistic idea, but by the late 1800s, it got mixed up again with race. And Germans and others, actually some English scholars were very important in this, they said, well, why was it so successful? Well, because the original Indo-European speakers were members of a superior race. They were the Aryans. They were this Nordic race. And they were better than other people. They were more adventuresome, so they spread. And in some places, they conquered and intermarried with other people and lost their racial purity. But in Northern Europe, they retained their racial purity. This was Nazi ideology, essentially. So it became very widespread in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and was responsible for, obviously, a lot of problems. And sort of, in many people's minds, it discredited this notion of historical linguistics because it was so misused. They didn't understand some of these other issues. Ironically, it looks like now from genetic and other sources of evidence that it's not the Germans who have the largest percentage of genetic background that could be traced back to these original Indo-Europeans. We're not sure about this. This is new research, but the Y DNA, that's just on the male chromosome, you can find certain markers and you could trace out relationships. And some scholars say that this one particular marker may be related to the initial Indo-European spread. Yeah, maybe. We're not sure at all. Its highest percentage is in Poland, not in Germany, and another high percentage in northern Iran. So maybe that's linked. And even in linguistics, it turns out the German connection, the Aryan connection, doesn't work out very well. The language that's most close, the modern language, living language, is probably closest to the ancient, original Proto-Indo-European is Lithuanian. Lithuanian is a very conservative language. It hasn't changed all that much. Not German. And actually, if you look at the German language, all the Germanic languages, and that includes the Scandinavian languages, includes English as well, they have a lot of words that cannot be traced back to this original Indo-European. So linguists think, well, probably the Indo-Europeans came in and imposed their language on people, but these people had a lot of their own words that they kept, and their own sounds that they kept. So the Germanic languages are actually sort of a little bit out of the mainstream in Indo-European. So they have different sounds, different words. And here's what's really bizarre. These non-Indo-European words in the Germanic languages, words about war and weapons, which seems totally opposite of what you'd expect. It's thought that the These first Indo-Europeans were warlike people who imposed their language. Well, why are the words in Germanic languages about engineering, agriculture, non-Indo-European? We don't really know. There's a lot of uncertainty about this. It's highly controversial, but it's intriguing. That's one thing about historical linguistics. It's really hard to be sure about things, but we can get multiple lines of evidence that indicate the same thing, and we can get a pretty high degree of certainty. So anyway, back in the 1800s, most scholars thought that the first Indo-Europeans were in Germany. Later on, by the mid-20th century, especially the late 20th century, the view changed. These are just names of scholars. So Maria Gimbutas, a Lithuanian-American archaeologist, came up with a very prominent thesis. And I'm sorry, the map is kind of hard to read here, but she placed it north of the Black Sea in the grasslands of what is now Ukraine and southern Russia. And Gimbutas and others had an idea of why the Indo-European language spread so massively was because they were the first people to domesticate the horse. This is the grassland area, lots of horses. We know horses were domesticated much later than cattle and sheep and goats. Relatively recently, probably about 4,000 to 6,000 years ago, when people domesticated the horse, that gave them tremendous advantages in mobility, advantages in warfare, even trading advantages. Other people wanted horses. They knew how to breed them. They could trade them. They knew how to deal with horses. Huge advantage. We find even among Native Americans that the languages of the people who took up the horses, like the Comanche, they were spreading as well. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going in and conquering people, but that can happen. And that's certainly what Gimbutas thought. So here's a picture of Gimbutas. She named her thesis the Kurgan Hypothesis out of these burial mounds. So she's an archaeologist, not a linguist, but she knows a lot about linguistics. And she's digging up these burial mounds in the grassland area, finding lots of horse remains, lots of weapons, people being buried as warriors. And what she did, essentially, she turned that Aryan thesis on its head. And she says these original Indo-Europeans were not this superior race of people. Rather, they were more violent and more warlike than others. And they came in with their horses, and they invaded, and they imposed their language. She's a great scholar, but and it's just showing her idea of how they spread. She's a great scholar, but she kind of went off the deep end towards the end of her life. And what she said was, in old Europe, before the Indo-Europeans came in, everyone was peaceful. We were gender egalitarian. Goddesses were as important as gods. Women and men were equal. There was no warfare. Well, probably not. Most certainly not. And she even said that's what gave rise to male domination. And the problem is there's male domination all over the world. It didn't work. So gods and goddesses of old Europe. There's a very popular book based on this in the 1980s that sold a best-selling book, Rian Aisha, The Chalice and the Blade. It was based on this. And so this became a very popular idea in the 80s, that this was the root of male domination and all of our problems of violence. Today, it's interesting. I've searching where the name Kurgan comes up, and here we find so in Maria Gimbutas called these early Indo-Europeans the Kurgans, based on their burial practice. Here's a game, the Blackmore Archives, and we have a group, online computer game. Here's a group called the Kurgans who toss their children into pits filled with starving dogs. So in other words, it's hard to separate the ideology from here. There's such a tendency to imbue these people with traits, either the superior Aryans or the horrible Kurgans. Not very scholarly. Well, at the same time, another archaeologist, very famous archaeologist named Colin Renfrew, decided to reinvestigate this whole thesis and wrote a book called Archaeology and Language. And he was coming out of an archaeological school in the 1980s that was very wary of any kind of migration in human history. And the reason is because archaeologists used to attribute any change they saw when they're digging through these horizons to migration. The pottery changes a little bit. Oh, a new group of people must have migrated in. Well, actually, people are inventive, and they change their pottery. So what Renfrew and others are saying, oh, we have been way too willing to look to see migration, and actually probably a lot of these changes were just gradual, and they were changes that people came up on their own. And he also didn't like this whole ideological burden that was placed on the thesis of the Indo-Europeans, whether Gimbutas's, they're nasty, horrible people, or the other view that they're the superior race. And so he, again, wanted to rethink the whole thing, and he may not see it, but he said, no, the Indo-Europeans didn't originate among horse riders and the people who domesticated the horse. He said it originated much earlier in what is now Turkey, which is not Indo-European speaking, but was at one time. And he said this originated with some of the early farmers thousands of years earlier. And why did the language spread? Because they had agriculture. So Europe before that time was hunting and gathering. Hunter-gatherers don't live in very large numbers. Farmers have 10, 20 times the density. And so he said farmers gradually moved. And we know this is true. We know that agriculture gradually moved, it's been called the Neolithic Period, at about these dates, out of what is now Turkey and the Fertile Crescent, and moved up into Central Europe. Now, what Gimbutas and most linguists would say, but yes, that's true, but this was thousands of years before Indo-European. Languages like Basque that are not Indo-European, they reflect this early movement of farmers. And then later, the Indo-Europeans came in and spread their languages, and most of these other ones disappeared. So it became very, very controversial and sort of back and forth movement. Other archaeologists and linguists, like David Anthony, who won a 2010 book award, they came up with what we'd call the revised steppe or grassland hypothesis. And they would say, yes, it looks to us from all the evidence we could see that Indo-European did originate north of the Black Sea among these pastoral, migratory, horse-riding people, but they didn't have massive invasions. They couldn't do it at that time. They didn't have organized states. These were small-scale societies, so it was a much more gradual process of infiltration. They're moving in, they're trading, they're raiding, it's true. In Indo-European myths, there's an awful lot about cattle raiding. If anyone's ever read any of the old Irish literature, one of the most famous books is called The Cattle Raid of Cooley. And why is this? Well, if you're a horse-riding people, it is really easy to steal people's livestock because it will walk away with you. You don't have to carry it. And so there was a lot of this raiding going on, and trading and peaceful interactions as well as intermarriage, and gradually those Indo-European languages spread. Peoples kept some of their own sounds and words from their previous languages. So a lot of the Indo-European languages have huge, what we call non-Indo-European substrates. We saw it with Germanic, it's true with Greek, it's true with the languages of northern India as well. So this became sort of the reigning theory among most linguists and archaeologists. And the Renfrew theory that it originated with farmers kind of died down until a group of biologists and computer scientists who believed this Renfrew theory that it originated among farmers, they decided to use their techniques from biology, evolutionary biology, and mathematics and apply it to this question. And they've had remarkable success in the public sphere. So this was just 2012. So they use very, very complicated techniques. In fact, they will say that they trace out more family trees of languages than there are atoms in the universe. I mean, this is massive computer hardware, dedicated to this question. And they will run these programs for weeks. These are ideas that came with evolutionary biology, and they've been tremendously successful in evolutionary biology. What you can do is take proteins that encode genes for different animals, and you can put them into these computer programs, and you can determine the relationship between different species that evolved from common ancestors much, much better. So they decided they could do the same with language. They could treat words that are related to each other just the way that biologists treat genes or the proteins that those genes are based on. And they could also use a geographical program that was based to trace viruses. So there's very complicated developments in epidemiology to show how viruses spread. And they said, well, we could use that same math to show how languages spread. They would have spread the same way that viruses do. I should say, I think it's total nonsense. That's what I'll try to bring up. But so here's from their website. It's saying not horses 2,000 to 4,000 years ago, rather agriculture. Here's 8,500 years ago, originating here, spreading, going to Europe, going down into South Asia. And they, I should say, they have some beautiful visualizations. They have animated maps, all based on these very powerful computer simulations of this thesis. It was picked up by the media immediately. And they just loved it. So here's the New York Times saying, family tree of languages have roots in Anatolia. That's modern Turkey. Say they have solved this problem. One of the things that they were saying too is, oh, you linguists and archaeologists, you've been working on this for 200 years and you haven't solved the problem. We're going to solve it for you. We're going to show how it really works. Scientific American then says, disease map pinpoints it. They illustrate this with, what is now a mosque. It was originally a Catholic cathedral, the Hagia Sophia in Turkey. Or here's even better, BBC. English language originated in Turkey. I'm glad they put the quotation marks because, of course, English originated in England, not in Turkey. But the idea is its distant mother language originated in what is now Turkey. And I don't know if you know Samuel Johnson, the great English lexicographer, looking especially grumpy, I think, at this news that his language originated in Turkey. My co-author, Asya Persalveg, and I have spent much of the last year working on this, and we have a forthcoming book that we need to finish in the next couple of months with Cambridge University Press, basically saying that this approach is, it's well-meaning, we appreciate it, but it just doesn't work. It's wrong. And we find lots of problems with it. I'll focus on two of them. One is the notion that linguistic evolution is so similar to organic evolution of animals and plants, that they can be analyzed in the same terms with the same tools. And that languages spread by demic means populations diffusion. That's how viruses spread. They spread by diffusion. But we don't think languages usually spread this way at all. They spread in different ways. Now, what the biologists do is construct, this is broken off, phylogenies. That means organisms descended from a common ancestral form. And so they construct linguistic phylogeny. So you can see humans and dogs and the like, and you can trace them back, all forms of life back to common ancestors. And so they're saying we can do the same thing with language. So here the phylogenetic method is the prehistory of languages, trace them back to a common root, back to first Indo-European, or even deeper back, using these same kinds of sophisticated computational techniques. One thing, though, is we know that in languages, words can jump from one language to another. And it used to be thought, well, in organic evolution, that doesn't happen. Genes go from the parents to the children and so on, but they don't jump from lineage. Well, actually, we know now sometimes they do. Viruses can sometimes take a gene from one species and implant it in another species. So modern trees of life have these odd connections. But in organic evolution, this is pretty rare. It doesn't happen very much. In linguistic evolution, it happens all the time. Languages are always borrowing words, and much more than words as well. But what these biologists have done is construct these family trees. So this is sort of a tree turned sideways from Proto-Indo-European and traced to all these modern languages, and they say they can show quite precisely when they differentiated, and how they spread, and where they spread. So this is a very sort of precise measurement. It looks very impressive, and it looks just like the kind of models that biologists construct for evolution of organisms. And I've simplified it a little bit so you can see these are subfamilies of Indo-European, Celtic, Welsh and Irish and the like, and the Romance languages and others. And this is how they've derived it, again, through these very complicated computer programs. One problem is, though, if you look at this on linguistic grounds, it fails. And this is something that my colleague does much more than I do, because she's a linguist, and she can show. So, for example, we know the Slavic languages are all related. There's an Indo-European subfamily. They all stem from a common ancestor. But we know from linguistic terms that there's several branches. There's something called East Slavic, Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian. They're very close in many ways. And linguists have known for over 100 years that these three languages are really close. They came from the same ancestor. We even have documentary evidence that shows this. But in this computer program, they have Polish in this same group. And Polish, by conventional linguistics, it's a Slavic language, yes, but it's way removed. So I should really looked at how did their computer program end up placing Polish along with Russian? And it's pretty clear why they did. 1600, so that's 400 years ago, Poland was a vast country, and it included what is now Belarus and Ukraine. And the Poles and Lithuanians were the rulers of this state, and that meant that a lot of their words from Polish spread into Ukrainian, for example. Now, our opponents say, we have methods of determining these loan words, but it's pretty obvious that their methods were not adequate to it. And another issue is that here's a conventional differentiation. So we start with a proto-language here, and one branch turns into Poland. Another branch then turns into the East Slavic languages, Belarusian and Ukrainian over here, and Russian over here. Russian really looks different because Russian was a more innovative language. It borrowed a lot of words from Turkic. It borrowed words from the Germanic languages. So Russian had many more changes. In Poland, Polish and Ukrainian are a little more conservative. And that makes what are cousin languages, Polish and Ukrainian, it makes them look like sister languages, and really they're just cousins. Again, these are things historical linguists are trained to do. And they use much more than words. They use sounds. They use grammatical structures. But the biologists just use words, and they get left out. The problem here is how linguistic evolution differs from biological evolution. And it differs in a lot of ways. There's no selective pressure. In biological evolution, there's selection for certain features by the environment. In language, it's not like, if you use an article or you don't use an article, that's going to change your reproductive success. There's really no evidence there. So it's divorced from that. The borrowing is much larger. I mean, look at English. English is a Germanic language, but most of our words are not Germanic. They come from Norman French, or they come from Latin, or they come from Greek. And we got words from languages all over the world. Languages borrow words so readily. Change can be huge. Languages... Now, we can understand Shakespeare pretty easily. Go back to Chaucer, it's hard. Go back to Beowulf, and that's Old English, but it is a different language. That's only that's going back 1,000 years or so. Totally different language. Languages don't change as much as they used to. Education and media, that makes languages stay the same. But where you don't have states and you don't have education and have media, languages are just moving all the time. Some more than others. And I say also it's impossible to trace back to the ultimate root. So we can trace back all these Indo-European languages, but can we go back farther than that? There have been some people who suggest, we ought to trace all languages back to Proto-Human, the first language spoken. But you can't do it because everything gets it's like reshuffling a deck. Once you go back more than about 8,000 years, the words have changed so much, the grammar has changed so much, the sounds have changed so much that you just can't trace back any farther than that. And it's completely different in biological evolution. Here, the farther back we go, here we have the fish and bony fish and sharks and amphibians and reptiles and mammals and birds. Sometimes when we're looking at relationships among the mammals, we're still not sure. Well, actually, the new techniques allow us to be sure. There's an animal called a red panda that lives in Asia. For a long time, we weren't sure. Is it in the raccoon family? Is it in the bear family? Is it in its own family? By these modern genetic techniques, now we know it's in its own family. But we never doubted that it was a carnivore, that it was a mammal, that it's a vertebrate, that it's an animal. I mean, those are all obvious. But with linguistic evolution, the farther back you go, the less certain it gets. And I'll give you some examples of that. Or if organic evolution were like linguistic evolution, we would find that something like the mammals actually originated from separate lineages. You know, mammals have a lot of features in common. Well, a few features in common, right? They all have milk, right? Mammary glands, that makes mammals. Mammals are milk-producing animals. But if it were like linguistic evolution, maybe you would have had a group of mammals that originated from birds, and then you had another group of mammals that originated from fish, and they somehow shared these genes that allowed them to produce milk. That's ludicrous in organic evolution. In linguistic evolution, it happens all the time. I'll give you an example from another language family. I mean, people still talk about Altaic languages. That includes Turkish, Mongolian, a bunch of other languages. Some even put Japanese and Korean in it. And Altaic languages have a lot of features in common. They have something called vowel harmony. All the vowels in one word have to be the same kind of vowel. They have the same sort of morphology. It's called agglutinative morphology. They have a lot of words in common. So it used to be thought, oh, they all stem from a common ancestor. Here's the problem. Linguists if you look back at old historical documents, the first documents we have in a Turkic language and the first documents in a Mongolian language, they look more different than the modern ones. That shouldn't be. In Indo-European, which is a real family, it's the opposite. Sanskrit and Latin look a lot more similar than Hindi and Italian, who are tracing back to a common root. With Altaic, it looks like there's three separate families, Turkic, Mongolian, and something called Tungusic. They originated from separate ancestors, but they intermarried with each other, they moved all around, and they shared these features. So, again, really different. I'll make one other point is we have some languages that are totally mixed. Here's a mixture of French and Cree, an American Indian language. Or here's one Turkish and Greek, Quechua and Spanish. They're like half and half. If organic evolution worked that way, we could have Krotgufans. Right? But of course we can't because they're so different. There are different ways then of looking at language, not as trees, but as like hedges with all these different branches moving back and forth between them. Or there's another that German scholars have come up with called the wave theory that says languages sometimes descend from mother languages to daughter languages and granddaughter languages. Yes, that's true. But you also have other processes where you might have a group of related languages and an innovation spreads in one and it spreads on its own. And then another innovation comes somewhere else and it spreads on its own. And then where you have a bunch of these innovations coinciding, a new language can be born. A very different model. And not as a substitute for the tree model, but as a complement. And with Indo-European languages, I'll just give you one example. So here's the big families of Indo-European languages. It's known that a lot of these families in the East, the K sound turned to an S sound. So the linguist difference, the Kentum languages, this comes from the word from 100, or the Satem languages. So you get this sound shift from K to S. But there was an extinct language found in eastern China. It doesn't exist anymore. But it's way in the east, and it has the K sound. So how do you explain that? Well, an innovation happened, and that innovation spread, but it didn't spread to the periphery. It spread in this one area. Other innovations spread in different areas. So again, it sort of messes up the tree. A few other issues here with languages is we tend to really identify languages with political groupings. You look at a language map, a modern language map, and it makes it look like, oh, they speak Danish in Denmark and Norwegian in Norway and Swedish in Sweden. These are all the Germanic languages. German in Germany, well, also an Austrian part of Switzerland and the like. But actually, languages are, if you look at what people actually speak, and especially what people spoke before modern standardization and modern education and modern politics, you get a welter of related dialects. And changes can occur through those dialects and spread around. So here's one showing Germanic dialects. And you can notice the boundary between the Netherlands and Germany. The dialects cross right across that boundary. So this is sort of more the pattern of earlier times where you got related dialects, and they're all changing in their different ways. It's not such a neat system. This is a map that these authors in science came up with, because in making these computer programs, what they do is they have to map extinct languages, modern languages. And so this is just part of their map, and this just shows different languages. So one thing Asya and I did is we just took these maps apart piece by piece by piece. And we found they're doing things like, it's maybe hard to see here, but they're mapping Romanian as if it's spoken everywhere in Romania, and it's not. There's millions of Hungarians in Romania. The political map and the language map, they don't coincide. So they had all kinds of problems in this map. They left out Moldova. It's a Romanian-speaking country. They just forgot about it, I think. And after we went through, they listed 103 languages, so we decided we'd find 103 mistakes in their maps. So we did that. I want to move on here, though. The other issue is, not only do they view languages as spreading, as evolving like organisms, but they also regard languages as spreading like viruses. And this is through the process of diffusion. Diffusion is a physical process, and you can mathematically model it very easily. What diffusion is in physics is if you put a little bit of ink in water, and it slowly spreads out. Individual molecules are moving randomly. It's a random sort of Brownian motion, as it's called. And so we have the mathematics to model this diffusional process. And that's how they modeled the spread of Indo-European. They said it started with these farmers, and these farmers didn't migrate. They just sort of randomly moved. And there's groups that are sort of moving on the frontier. There's these places that are occupied by hunters and gatherers. They can move in. But nobody would have moved more than about 10 miles in their life. And so this is the kind of model they make, and they use it in their map. What's interesting is, and again, we know that agriculture spread into Europe at this time, and in this early period, we don't know what the languages were. But somewhat earlier, there were some archaeologists who did a study of the spread of agriculture into Europe, and they found that diffusion wouldn't work. Diffusion doesn't work because it's too slow. They said there had to be something else. There had to be migration, and migration is modeled mathematically as advection. So advection is the mass movement of a fluid or some other substance. So when fog moves in here, as it did it this morning, that's the movement of air off the Pacific. It hits that cold water, it turns to fog, and it moves inland. So that's diffusion, and these authors showed that that's advection. If you use advection, that can actually fit the timeline of the spread of agriculture. In other words, people were not just diffusion, they were migrating. They were moving at larger distances. And they may have, when they were migrating, and again, these are not the Indo-Europeans, these are people who were before the Indo-Europeans who brought agriculture. It looks like many of them were looking for something called loess. Loess is a really easily worked soil. It's fertile, it's light. These early farmers, this was in the Neolithic, in the Stone Age. They didn't have iron, even bronze tools. They couldn't deal with heavy forests. They couldn't deal with heavy soils. They liked these grassy areas where loess was, and you can actually trace their movement up the Danube into these original areas. The Buchard et al., that's the science article that we're critiquing. They claim that they have a feature-rich geographical model, but they don't. All they have is land, which they regard as completely flat, isotropic, that means featureless, and water. These other authors who talked about advection, they bring into their equations, they're model makers too, they bring in altitude and latitude and, deserts, that shouldn't be desserts, sorry. And the fact that these authors in science have this simplistic model of diffusion means that they come up with just crazy patterns. They have this beautiful animated map that shows what they say is the spread of Indo-European languages. And like I say, it's a lovely thing to look at because it has colors, it has lines. These lines indicate language families. But if you trace it out, you'll see they're showing North Germanic, that's a subfamily of Indo-European, coming to Iceland. And, and we can see they're showing in 2009 AD or CE, in 909 CE, it reaches the Faroe Islands. And then in 1000, it's close to Iceland. And then 1049, it finally reaches Iceland. Their model is showing these people living on boats that are slowly drifting northward. I mean, we know Iceland was discovered. It was actually first discovered by Irish monks. And then the Vikings found it, and they moved in. And we know who did it, and we know when they did it. This is all recorded history. Their model doesn't show it. One other thing, the Tokharians were this Indo-European group that ended up in northwestern China. Now, you may have heard of these mummies found in China that are red-headed, and look, these were the Tokharians. Later, they were mostly supplanted by people speaking Turkic languages. They lived in these in a desert area in these oases, and there are mountains to the north that are 25,000 feet high. And the model that they use have the speakers moving right up the top of these mountain ranges. So again, it's not a feature-rich model. So if languages don't simply diffuse like this in this slow pattern, how do they move? Well, they move partly by migration, but they often move in a way that has nothing to do with people movement, because languages can move separately from people. And we know this from historical sources. We're here in Belgium and northern France, and there was this boundary between Romance languages, early form of French or Picard dialect, and a Germanic language, Dutch or an early form of Flemish. And we know that in the Middle Ages that it moved north. French moved north. This means French people were moving in and supplanting them? No, it meant everyone was bilingual on this frontier, or just about everyone. And eventually people start teaching their children their second language rather than their first. This happens all the time. It happens today. Breton, it's a Celtic language. It's related to Welsh. We know its earlier form. It's disappearing today. 200,000 people speak it, but most of them are over 60. They're not passing it on to their kids. They're teaching their kids to speak French. And this isn't a new process. It's been going on forever. How did Romance languages spread in Europe? Originally, they were just spoken, the Romance languages, just in central Italy around Rome. Well, the Romans conquered most of Europe, and they didn't, it wasn't like Romans were migrating everywhere. They were establishing a few colonies here and there, but their language was a language of prestige. People learned it. Later on, it became the language of the Roman Catholic Church, and that helped spread it. So eventually, the Romance language or Latin spread, and then it differentiated. It wasn't because there were so many Romans that just overwhelmed everybody. Rather, it was their cultural prestige. Last thing, I know we're almost out of time, the last thing I'll do is talk about how languages' boundaries can actually shift back and forth historically. And this is something that the model that these scientists use that doesn't allow. It's a one-way street in their model. But in actuality, you can go back and forth. And I'll show you an area in the sort of modern northeastern Germany. This shows the Germanic languages, Indo-European subfamily, 750 BC. That area was thoroughly Germanic. But then the Germans left that area. In the late Roman Empire, the Huns, who spoke probably a Turkic language, they moved in, they conquered. The Roman Empire was weakening, and most of the Germanic peoples, or at least many of them, they migrated into the Roman Empire. They conquered large areas. The Franks were Germanics, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Burgundians, the Vandals. These were Germanic tribes. Some of them stayed put, but in the eastern part, these areas were essentially mostly abandoned. The Huns were there. Rural people didn't want to be under the overlordship of the Huns, so a lot of them left, and you ended up with areas that were probably not wholly abandoned, but partly abandoned. That just shows the empire of Attila the Hun. But we know then that afterwards that Slavic-speaking people, that's another Indo-European branch, it originated over here, but there was kind of a vacuum of people that had moved out, and the Slavs, for some reason, were reproducing very rapidly, so a lot of them moved in, and the same area became Slavic-speaking. Saxon, that would have been Germanic, but these people were Slavic speakers. No doubt there were some Germanic people who remained, but they were sort of engulfed by this Slavic wave. Then later, the Germans started to expand to the east again. There's a German term for it. The Germans were reproducing in large number, and they were gradually moving back and turning these areas German-speaking again. Didn't mean they killed all the Slavs or drove them out. They came in large numbers. They were somewhat sort of a higher prestige group. They were associated with more stronger political structures, and their language spread. So it's re-Germanized. Not entirely to this day. This shows a map of German language circa about 1900. Pink is German. And there were some areas called Sorbian. There's still 40,000 people in Germany who speak a Slavic language. They're a remnant group to the German spread. And notice how these pink splotches are all over the place. Because they're moving, sometimes, they're leapfrogging. They're jumping other areas. And that's another thing about language. It's often really intermixed. Eastern Europe at 1900, you had areas where there was no dominant language. There could have been a half a dozen languages spoken in a relatively small area. A lot of multilingualism and the like. What happened to the same area? Well, in some of these areas, after World War II, Germans were expelled, up to 5 million from what is now Poland. After World War II, Poland was shifted. Soviet Union took its eastern part, and in return they gave them a big chunk of Germany, and the Germans were expelled, and Poles moved in. So we have these are large areas that had been part of Poland. They're turned over, they had been part of Germany, they're turned over to Poland, and we get population movement again. So we look at this boundary between Germanic speakers and Slavic speakers, and it's moving back and forth over history all the time, as do many. Here, I think this is my last map. This shows languages of Europe circa 1950. Here's that Sorbian language. A few Germans left here, not many at all. That map shows the boundary between Poland and Germany, and Polish and German being pretty precise. That's only because people were expelled on purpose after World War II. The usual case is, like you see here with Romania, where the political map, the boundaries, and the language boundaries, they don't coincide. Increasingly they do because governments want people to speak the same language, but that's not the historical pattern. So finally, just to conclude, I'd say linguistics is a very powerful tool for historical investigation, but we've got to be wary. One thing is to be wary of what I say is scientism. I don't mean science here. I'm a total defender of science, but sometimes scientific techniques are applied inappropriately. I think that's what's happened in this case. People have taken these very powerful tools for biology and inappropriately applied them to linguistics where they don't work. And one of the reasons why they want to do this, I think, is it's a great way of simplifying it. They're saying, oh, you linguists, you spent 200 years and you haven't solved the problems. We want to solve the problems for you. But to really do it correctly, you need to know phonology. You need to know the sound patterns. You need to know morphology, how words are put together. You need, as well as the vocabulary. Linguistics is really complicated, and linguists have spent hundreds of years developing these techniques to allow us to figure out languages that are related or not related and where they came from, not with 100% accuracy, but with a pretty good sense in many cases. So I'm all in favor of the hard work of learning the details of language, of history and geography, rather than trying to come up with this kind of shortcut where the computer can solve our problems for us. So thank you, and I'm very happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you, Martin. Do we have questions?
I would like to make a comment before we go into questions. Martin is often teaching a class at Stanford for the adult community, similar to our LLL. And he's one of the more popular lecturers that often draws 100 to 200 people for 6 to 8 weeks. I think we understand.
Well, thank you.
Martin, do you anticipate that not only California, but pretty soon maybe all of this country will be Spanish speaking?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. There are parts of the United States that have been Spanish speaking for a long time. Northern New Mexico and southern Texas have been essentially Spanish speaking all along. But English is, a powerful dominant language in the United States. And in general, we find that by the third generation, most Spanish immigrants are much more comfortable in English. Many of them lose Spanish altogether. So no, I don't think that's happening. I think Spanish will remain a very important secondary language, but I don't see it supplanting English. In fact, there's a certain concern in the Hispanic community that the kids and grandkids often they don't want to speak Spanish; they'd rather speak English. There were similar things with German and Italian. There were areas in the Midwest that had German language presses all the way up to World War I. World War I sort of did in German in the United States. And it actually took longer. It took longer for German to disappear in the U.S. It went through more generations. But again, in a bilingual situation.
Understandably, written language came much later than spoken language, starting maybe with hieroglyphics and Egyptian and Spanish. Right. Chinese also. Right. But phonetic language came about 4,000 years ago. Then you take a common word in the English language like mater in Spanish, mutter in German, madre in Spanish, and mother in English. How much drift in language, because that goes back 4,000 years, do you use in your study of languages? You didn't mention at all how you use the written languages. You could go to Chinese, for example, and get their pronunciation of mother. Is it related somehow to any other language? And how do you relate these written languages to genetic?
That's a great example. So that's an Indo-European term, MAT for mother. So I think all Indo-European languages have a cognates. That means words descended from that common root word. And mother's a great example. Certain words, family relationships, body parts, tend to be very conservative and they're not borrowed very often. So these are the good words you want to use. And in written sources, yes, you can trace that out precisely. So like you say, the Phoenicians came up with the first phonetic alphabet, something about 4,000 years ago. In fact, all phonetic alphabets in the world are traced back to Phoenicia and modern Lebanon. And that's pretty well known how that worked. What historical linguists, though, can do, they can trace out these words even when there were no written records, often not perfectly, but pretty well, because there are regular sound changes. So if one sound change, if you say change from a D to a T or something like that, that will be found throughout a language. It won't just change in a few words. It'll change in every word, or virtually every word, or at least every word that has that sound in the same place in the word. And then when you change one sound, that will change other sounds as well. So this was something that the German linguists in the early 1800s figured out. There's something called Grimm's Law from actually the Grimm brothers who did the fairy tales. They were linguists, or philologists as they were called at the time. And they worked out these regular sound changes. So actually there are people have written stories in Proto-Indo-European, the original mother language, never recorded. I mean, this was well before language was written down. But they figure they know enough about these sound changes that they know what it would have sounded like. Not completely. Actually, there are different schools that say, no, that wouldn't have been a Q sound here. It would have been a different sound. But there's a lot of agreement because that is a scientific project to trace out these sound changes. So it's actually a little fable. You can look it up online. It's the sheep and the horse. But it's and you can see the different how scholars have changed in writing this Indo-European tale over the last 100 years or so. So thanks, great question.
In addition to generation change, what are one or two of the other key variables that will help determine whether Gaelic will be revived, whether Yiddish will be kept alive?
Yeah, another great question. Language revival is something that a lot of linguists are very interested in. because a language goes extinct about every 2 weeks. So there's massive language extinction happening, usually at small-scale tribal languages, but some very important languages. So Yiddish may be in some danger. It's never been encouraged in Israel. What Israel did was revive Hebrew, which is a fascinating case, because Hebrew was a liturgical language. It wasn't a spoken language. And they sort of modernized it and changed it and successfully revived it. The Irish have been trying to do the same with Irish Gaelic without nearly as much success. Israel had been able to revive Hebrew for a variety of different reasons. But they do subsidize the Irish language. And actually, in Wales, they subsidize Welsh. We were in Wales a few years ago, and we were tuning the radio and found a station with Welsh rap music. And they're getting subsidies to do that, to try to keep it alive. And Welsh seems to sort of be doing okay. Breton in France, on the other hand, it's classified as moribund. Very few young people are speaking it. There's oddities with politics. So in France, the cultural prestige of Parisian French is such that Basque has virtually disappeared. The languages of Southern French, Provençal and these others, they're disappearing. In Spain, on the other hand, and this is really ironic, under Franco, the Spanish tried to force people to speak Castilian Spanish. And then there was a huge reaction among especially the Catalans and the Basques, who weren't going to put up with that. So Basque is much more alive on the Spanish side of the border than it is on the French side. And it's ironically because the Spanish tried to force them to, and the French didn't do that. In France, it was just more of an issue of, let them speak what they want, but the prestige of French was high enough that Basque is, there's 200,000 Basque speakers in France. It's not like it's gone, but not nearly to the same extent. So it's really going to vary a lot from case to case, and sometimes it can be really surprising how it works out. I should say, too, there's UC Berkeley's doing a lot of work to revive some of the American Indian languages of Northern California, Hupa and some of these others. And some kids are they're interested in it. They want to learn it, but so they're learning it from their great-grandparents in some cases.
What do you anticipate that in the modern era English will do to modify other languages around the world, since it is now transportation, scientific, and so forth, sort of the common language?
English is de facto the global language. It really has happened, much to the consternation of the French especially. And so in France, there's an academy that tries to keep out English words, but they're fighting an uphill battle, so English words are spreading. There's a big issue in a lot of European countries with multinational companies, whether they're going to use, say, are they going to use German in Germany? Are they going to use English? That's a battle, but English is increasingly spreading. So I don't see really any language that's going to be a challenge to English, partly because English is so deeply embedded, say, in India. And if you look at the countries with the most number of English speakers, United States is number one, but Britain is not number two. India is usually going to be number two. I think Nigeria now has as many English speakers as England does. So there's so many parts of the world where English is. India is a classic case. India is a multilingual country. They tried to make Hindi the national language, and the southern Indians were ready to rebel. The Tamils don't want to learn Hindi. They say, we have a common language. It's English. And so English is an associate official language of India, but it is the common language in business and even to a large extent in government. There's one linguist who said the language of the future is going to be Hinglish, a combination of English and Hindi. I don't think so. Well, Mandarin, and China is really spreading, working really hard to spread Mandarin. People are learning it, but a tonal language is hard to learn for people who don't speak with tones, and most people in the world don't have those sort of tones. Of course, English has its big problems with spelling, orthography. I'd like to simplify it, but I can't convince many people to do that. So no, I don't. Mandarin is going to become increasingly important. I don't think it's going to supplant English.
William Pittman and Walter Ryan put forth a very elegant hypothesis that the Indo-European languages originated with the shrinking of the Black Sea at the end of the Cold War. I mean, the Cold War, the last ice age.
Yes.
And then the subsequent and rapid flooding of the Black Sea by the Mediterranean. And last time I heard you talk, you were a tad dismissive. I asked after the group, what you thought about that. I'm wondering what your thoughts are now, because to me it's very convincing. So unconvince me.
Well, we do know that in the last glacial period that the Black Sea was a separate body of water. It was not connected to the Mediterranean. Sea levels were much lower because so much water was locked up in the ice caps, and then the ice caps melt, and eventually there was this catastrophic flooding of the Black Sea. There's a lot of underwater archaeology now that's showing that 100 feet deep in the Black Sea, there's substantial remains. So I think that certainly could have played a major part in it. Probably wasn't the the only reason for it, because the area is substantial, but it's not large enough to account for Indo-European languages spreading over this vast area. I thought there had to be some advantage that these speakers had. So some people say it was agriculture, but that doesn't fit with that theory at all, because agriculture came actually much earlier. I think it's much more convincing that it was horses. So I don't doubt that was part of the reason. I just don't think it's the entire reason. But it's certainly a fascinating case, and it could be associated with a lot of flood legends, because this would have been a catastrophic event when suddenly the water just starts pouring in massive quantities. Yes?
My question is about, going back to a question ago, tonal languages.
Oh, yes.
I know the Chinese is a tonal language. I know there are some tonal languages in Africa.
Yes, there are.
What percentage of the world's languages are tonal?
Yeah, I believe it's something in the order of 20%. I'd have to check that. They're common in Southeast Asia, Vietnamese, Thai, also a lot of Southeast Asian languages. West Africa has a lot of tonal languages as well. Some of the Native American languages are tonal, but it would be East and Southeast Asia, and West Africa would be the main centers of that. It's thought that one way that tonality originated, certainly in the case of Chinese and other Sinitic languages, but they started losing a lot of their consonant sounds, and you end up with a relatively small sound inventory, and that can lead then to development of alternative means of conveying meaning, and so you end up with tones. On the other hand, Hawaiian is not a tonal language at all. It only has 12 consonants. So there are some interesting theories of why some languages have such larger sound inventories, and there's a lot of work being done on how tonality originated. And it's in the stage where yet that people can't be certain how that did. There's a fascinating website called WALS, World Atlas of Linguistic Structures, I think, and you can go into that and you can look for all kinds of linguistic features, and it's an interactive site, and they can show you where you can find languages with that feature, like tonality or word order in a sentence or certain kinds of sounds. There's a lot of sounds that English doesn't have that many other languages do, and you can see where they're distributed. So it's a fascinating website. If you're interested, I'd recommend that.
Several years ago, I was reading an article about the future of China.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the scholars who was, I can't think of his name, speculated that within 20 years, China will have a population of 200 or 300 million whose principal language is English.
Mm.
And they will be leading like a Western European life, and the rest of the Chinese are going to left to sink or swim.
Well, it's an interesting idea. I'm suspicious of that idea. People aren't dropping Chinese. Of course, a lot of people in China are learning English, so I think you will have a bilingual population. China does have tremendous geographic disparities in economic development. So you can go from, say, Shanghai or Hong Kong, of course, and highly developed, international, cosmopolitan, wealthy places, yet many parts of interior China are still very poor, and we often forget that. But even the poor areas are improving, and there's tremendous nationalism in China, and that seems to be strengthening, if anything. We look at conflict over Japan with some very small islands in the East China Sea. Chinese nationalism is really strong, especially among the young people. So I think they're going to maintain that. But another issue is that a lot of people in China are not fluent in Mandarin Chinese. That's the first language of about maybe 70%. South China has a variety of other languages. And actually, it's the richest part of China are not Mandarin speaking. They speak these other languages. Most people are bilingual, but it's a challenge because you have your own Chinese dialect, they call it, but they're really separate languages. And then you have to learn Mandarin, and then if you want to be international, you're going to have to learn English as well. So it's one of those challenges of language.
Our last question.
Just recently, the Roma have gotten a lot of publicity with child abduction and things. And a day or two ago, the paper was saying that their dark color comes from India, and they are Romance. So what did the Roma speak? It's an Indo-Roman.
Yeah, so it can be confusing because you have the word Roma, which sounds like Rome, or Romanian. Romania has the highest percentage of Roma, but they're completely separate words. Rome comes from the Romani word for person. So Romani is the language of the Roma people. It is definitely Indo-European, and it is definitely Indic. It comes from what is now India. The Roma were probably originally what are called camp followers, groups of people who would follow armies and supply them with certain services. Horse trading, fortune telling, soldiers are interested in that, prostitution, tinkering, and these sorts of things. And somehow this group, a caste group of camp followers, ended up moving. We can trace their path through their language. They picked up massive numbers of Persian or Farsi words, Armenian words, and Greek words. So we can trace their movement through those areas by these linguistic accretions. And actually, Romani is a big issue in our discussion of Indo-European because the people we're arguing against claim that it's separated from Hindi and the other northern Indian languages much earlier than it actually did. And they say that because it has all of these other words. Well, these were borrowed words. And we can pinpoint that it didn't separate from what is now Hindi till about 1,000 years ago. And we know that because the old Indo-European languages of India had masculine, feminine, and neuter words. They got rid of the neuter words about 1,000 years ago, and all the formerly neuter words were either assigned to masculine or feminine. In Romani, it worked the same as in Hindi, and that wouldn't happen by chance. So that meant when that change occurred, the Romani were still in India, and they left afterwards. We can date that back to about 1,000 years ago. They first, historical sources say they first arrived in southeastern Europe in about the year 1300. And then spread. But they're still most widespread in the southeast, Romania and Bulgaria and these areas. They also have a much higher birth rate than other Europeans, and they still have very low rates of education, high rates of petty crime. It's a big problem, and it's going to become a bigger problem. It's something that Europe is having a really difficult time dealing with. Because now with the EU, Romania and Bulgaria are part of the EU. They're not in the Schengen Land Agreement yet, but they're scheduled to be part of that, which means that anyone can move anywhere. So lots of Roma are moving into the cities of Western Europe and in France. Throughout Western Europe, you've got this issue now. So thank you. That's a fascinating example. Appreciate it.
We'd like to thank Dr. Martin Lewis for coming and addressing us again at the symposium, and we welcome you back the next time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.